Hello and welcome back. Today, we are going to be picking up with part two of our lecture series on the Vietnam War. We had left off, Diem was in charge of the South, Ho Chi Minh is in charge of the North. There were elections that were supposed to happen that got postponed because it was pretty clear that the communists would have won those elections. And so now, at this point, the communists feel like they have been cheated out of a unified Vietnam. And in the South, Diem is getting more and more paranoid that there are infiltrators trying to sabotage his government, right? He's already been corrupt. He's already been arresting political prisoners. He's been doing terrible things to the Buddhist monks in the South, destroying their temples, having them arrested, and whatnot. And so it's under this context that we're going to see the formation of the National Liberation Front. The NLF is essentially an offshoot of the North Vietnamese government. The people that are in the capital of the South, which is Saigon. Saigon is the capital of the South. They refer to the NLF as the Viet Cong or the VC. And so throughout the rest of the lecture series, I'll refer to it as both the NLF and as the VC or Viet Cong. Mostly, I think I'll probably use VC or Viet Cong because I think that's how most people reference them. But the NLF is essentially just an organization, primarily Southerners, Southern Vietnamese, that are sympathetic to the North. And so they're communist, or they're just people that have been persecuted by the Diem government. And so, a lot of poor rural peasants, they're not benefiting under the South's government, under Diem's government. The cities in the South are doing pretty well. Saigon's doing pretty well. But the countryside, not so much. A lot of Diem's followers, because of the support they get from the government, have snatched up all the land. And so there's lots of really poor peasants that are, actually sympathetic to the communists because the communists are talking about land reform and giving some of that land to these poor peasants. And so what they're going to do is they're essentially just like an infiltration wing of the northern government, mostly working, pretty independent, but definitely coordinating with the North. It's going to be the NLF that is, really going to start to concern the Kennedy administration and later the Johnson administration. Kennedy's going to be the first one to point him out. He writes what's known as the 61 White Paper, which essentially just denounces the NLF. It's the first time America is going to be introduced to the idea of the Viet Cong. And he's going to say essentially that they're just puppets of Hanoi. Hanoi's the capital in the north, and so the communist capital. And we're gonna have a real problem with the VC because as Americans, we're used to really fighting a clear and concise enemy. World War One and Two, the Germans wore uniforms. They were easy to be able to recognize and point out. You knew who the civilians were. You knew who the soldiers were, and so you had a clear-cut enemy to fight. The VC is going to be really troublesome to America because they're not uniformed. They're dressed as peasants. They're sabotaging things, hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Attacking the North. Attacking the Southern government in particular, but eventually attacking American interests as well. And so, they'll attack us, then they'll run into a village and they'll disguise themselves as villagers. Well, we really struggle with this because we want to be able to attack our enemy, but we don't want to have to hurt the civilian population. And so there's going to be lots of mistakes that are going to be made. There's going to be lots of frustration. There's even going to be a few massacres that are going to happen on the American end. I think a lot of soldiers during this time period get a really bad rap. I think that's because of the media and the university system in America and their opposition to the war. We'll talk about that later on. But I always want to remind you that the average American soldier, and as a matter of fact, not even just the average American soldier, because we are going to talk about some atrocities that are really the result of VC in civilian clothes attacking us and then hiding in the civilian population. And so, that is the root cause of what some of these massacres are going to be. But we are going to talk about some pretty nasty stuff that American troops are going to do, most specifically in My Lai. But I always want to make sure that we point out here that 99% of American soldiers, I'm making that percentage up, but the vast majority of American soldiers are good people. They're not committing atrocities. They're not killing babies. They're not raping villagers. Although there will be some examples of that. So as we talk about these things, always keep that in mind because we want to be fair. We want to be able to talk about the atrocities that happened. And that happened by our soldiers under our watch. But we also want to make sure that we don't paint all the soldiers with one big broad brush. Just like when we talk about civil rights, not all black people are the same with the same interests, right? Not all white Southerners are racist. In history, we have to speak in generalities because we can't talk about every individual in America. There's been hundreds of millions of them throughout history, but we always have to make sure that we're not prejudiced against any of these groups, that we fairly assess what happened. So, it's going to be Kennedy that denounces the VC, says that this is a real problem. And because of that, he's going to start to increase military aid to the South, technical aid to the South, and economic aid to the South. And so we're going to start sending in American advisors into to help DM. And so this is escalation. So Kennedy is, increasing our involvement in Vietnam. Later, Johnson is really going to escalate things very specifically because of the VC and the threat that the VC are to the Southern government. So Kennedy, he's going to have some advisors that are going to urge him to get out. They're going to say, look, Vietnam's not really strategically important. They don't have a lot of resources that we need to protect for the capitalist democracies like, in the Middle East. There's not a whole lot of strategic importance. We've got military bases in South Korea. We have them in Japan. We'll still, even if we leave Vietnam, we'll still be a power in the Pacific. And they're making that argument. Well, Kennedy can't have that. Remember, he is, if you go back to the lectures on the Kennedy administration, Kennedy is absolutely adamant that he be seen as a cold warrior and that he doesn't seem weak on communism, right? That's a holdover from the McCarthy era, right? That we talked about in a previous lecture as well. He doesn't want to look weak there. And his foreign policy has really been, not great. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster. He kind of redeems himself with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but his, Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which is really received well in America. A lot of people blame him for, pushing the Soviet Union, and they end up building the Berlin Wall because of that. I don't know if that's, absolutely accurate, but people are blaming him for that. So he doesn't want to look weak in Vietnam. And so he will reject this idea of abandoning Vietnam altogether. And so he's going to be the one. And another reason why history, fair historians are pretty critical about the Kennedy administration is because he is going to escalate our involvement here. I think that assessment is probably unfair as well, because you got to remember the context of the time period. Nobody can seem soft on communism, and everybody really believes in domino theory and containment. And so, whether or not that's accurate, it's not, because spoiler alert here, Vietnam will become all communist, and we're not going to see this massive spread of communism in the area. Cambodia and Pol Pot, but Vietnamese and Cambodians don't get along. So, side note. But we're not really going to see that spread, but everybody believed it. And so because everybody believed it, I just don't think it's fair to, just kind of assume that people can see past the context of their times. And so Kennedy will step up the involvement. He's not going to go full war, right? I mean, Kennedy Just like with the Bay of Pigs, he didn't send in the American Air Force to help support because he always is trying to find this middle path. Just like he didn't, want to bomb the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He again took the middle path. He does the same thing here in Vietnam, and he doesn't start a war. He's just going to slowly start to aid the Diem government. Now, one of the problems with protecting the South against the Viet Cong is that the Vietnamese South is this really the rural areas. People are really spread out super far. They're not, it's easy to protect the cities, and we do that fairly well with, one exception, the Tet Offensive, and we'll talk about that later. But for the most part, we can protect the cities pretty easily. We've got military bases there. The VC, there's no way that the VC in a battle are going to be able to stand up to the American military. We're just better trained. We've got better equipment. We would just annihilate them. So the VC just choose not to fight us that way. And choose not to fight the South that way. What they do is they'll attack small villages, small farmers. They'll essentially say convert to being VC and help us, or we'll kill you and your family. We'll destroy your homes and destroy your farms. And many of these peasants, they don't want to deal with that. They feel like America can't protect them, and so they just, okay, fine, we'll help you. We'll store your weapons here. We'll spy for you and tell you where the American troops or the South Vietnamese troops are going to go. And so it's really hard to get those rural peasants to feel safe enough to help us out. And so what the South, and with the aid of American advisors, come up with is a way to try and protect those peasants, which is the Strategic Hamlet Program. This is going to be a disaster. I'm just going to say it right away. Because essentially what you're building is like internment camps for these rural peasants. It's really going to alienate these Southerners and make them more upset at Diem and the Americans, and make them turn. If you're upset at Diem and the Americans, your alternative then are the VC, and so it's actually going to It's designed. The program's designed to help protect the Southern peasants. But really what it does is it alienates them so much that it kind of pushes the Southern peasants into the hands of the Viet Cong. So let's talk about why. Well, what is the Strategic Hamlet Program? Well, what the idea is, well, if we can't protect you when you're all spread out everywhere, right, and you're miles and miles and miles apart, we can't put soldiers in everybody's house. But what we can do is create small villages, right? Build, essentially dorm rooms that are just filled with bunks of beds. Surround it with the fence. Put some barbed wire around it, and machine gun posts, and what we can have you do is that's where you're going to live. Well, sounds great, right? Can we protect them from the VC there? Absolutely. The VC aren't going to storm one of these hamlets. It's too risky. So you're pretty much safe when you're sleeping in that hamlet. The problem is you're just the people living there are so far away from their farms that it makes their lives miserable, right? They still have to make a living. They still have to, farm their land. And so a lot of times, these strategic hamlets are miles and miles and miles away from their homes. Well, we're not talking about 1950s, 60s America here, where every family owns a car, and we've got an interstate highway system. That doesn't exist. That doesn't exist most places in the world. I mean, America is so ridiculously wealthy that our poor people are rich in most other countries. And so, we have these luxuries that other people don't have. And so these farmers, these South Vietnamese farmers, literally are required to sleep in the hamlet system, then wake up, while it's still dark outside, walk miles and miles and miles to their farm for the 12 hours a day that they have to farm, because, right, you have a lot of the farming is being done by hand and not tractors, and the technology is very limited. And then at the end of the day, after working 12 hours in the hot sun, they've got to walk the miles and miles and miles back and check in at the hamlet before curfew, wake up and repeat. Well, how inconvenient is that? I mean, it's massively inconvenient. And these farmers feel like they're in jail. They feel like they can't get their work done, that their farms, and then when they're in the hamlet system, this is another thing to think about. Their farms are left unprotected. And so the VC, when they come through and they see an abandoned farm, they see, oh, they're in the hamlet system. They must support the South Vietnamese government. Let's burn their farm down. And so you've been working for months and months to get your crops going and having to walk all these extra miles. And it's taken up every single day, every single hour of every single day that you've had. You're not getting any sleep. And then after months and months and months, you're getting ready to harvest your crop. And then you find that the VC stole all your crop, because they need to eat, and then burned your house down. I mean, who are you going to be mad at? Yeah, you're mad at the VC, sure, but the root of the problem is going to be the hamlets. I mean, because the VC are essentially saying, stay at home and help us hide some guns and report on some American troop movements, and we'll leave your farm alone. And so, given those two choices, many members of the rural community in South Vietnam are going to say, this hamlet system it's like prison. It's you might be protecting my life, but you're not protecting my livelihood. And the VC, they just say, I got to tell them about where the white people are going, and I just have to store some of your guns in my shed, and you're going to leave me alone? Fine, I'll do that and I'll get on with my life. And so the Strategic Hamlet Program really turns the countryside against the South Vietnamese government and the Americans. Now, the cities remain pretty loyal, right? With the military bases popping up in all these major cities, that brings in a ton of money. So business is kind of booming in the major cities. People really like the Americans because we're bringing in, for the most part, there's going to be some resistance there, right? But for the most part, we're bringing in a bunch of money, a bunch of soldiers are starting to come in, and businesses are going to pop up, and the cities are pretty much going to thrive. But it's going to become the story of two South Vietnams. The countryside that tends to be sympathetic to the Viet Cong in the north, and the cities that tend to be sympathetic to the Southern government and to the Americans. So the NLF is going to start to see some success because the Hamlet system is so culturally insensitive. And by 63, it's pretty clear that the Diem government is not going to be able to make it. And so we've talked about this several times in previous lectures. Some military generals come to the Americans and say, can we get rid of Diem? We see that he's persecuting all these people. The Hamlet system is turning the South against us. He's not instituting the right land reforms and doing those kind of things. He's stealing from the government. Political prisoners, I mean, as Americans, political prisoners, I mean, that stands against everything that we support. And so the Americans will say, fine, we really don't want Diem dead. So we come up with a plan to sneak him out. But when the coup happens, one of the generals that's trying to that captures Diem and is supposed to, put him in a car and fly him to America, not from the car, put him in the car, take him to an airport, fly him to America. Don't want to confuse you there. No flying cars, unless you consider helicopters flying cars. I don't know. But anyway, one of the generals finds Diem, and it's unfortunate for Diem that this general, his family had been arrested by Diem and had been sent to re-education camp, and so that general actually ends up killing Diem. And so the generals come to America, ask to overthrow Diem. Washington essentially, we're not like, okay, we just kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, right? And, try and come up with a plan to get Diem out, but he ends up getting executed anyway. It's at this point that the generals take over and things don't really get better. We're never able to really find good leadership for the government in South Vietnam, and it's going to be a real serious part of the reason why we're not able to actually win this war. I know some people think, we didn't lose Vietnam. We'll talk about that later as the war wraps up. It really depends on how you define lose. I have my own personal opinion, but we'll talk about that later. So the conflict is now going to start to escalate. We're going to see Johnson is going to start to recognize, because of the VC and the ineptitude of the Southern government, that we're going to have to step up our involvement. And so Johnson is, going to start to increase American involvement in the region. And one of the things he's going to do is he's going to send some warships into the Gulf of Tonkin. And so when he sends these warships into the Gulf of Tonkin, they're going to actually be patrolling kind of the coast of Vietnam, both the north and the south. And the reality is they're spying, and now everybody knows they're spying. We're going to kind of deny that they're actually spying, but they are. We're listening into what's going on in the north, and we're doing it from out in the ocean. The north doesn't like it. In reality, there's not just a whole bunch that they can really do because they don't have a navy, but they are harassing these ships. They're sending out little speed boats, like torpedo boats, is what they call them. But I hate calling them torpedo boats because it makes them sound much more dangerous than they are. And they start harassing these American ships. This is going to be the event that is going to escalate the Vietnam War by massive proportions. And so we've got the USS Maddox, which is a destroyer. And so there's, when we talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, there's actually like a couple of attacks that happen here. Or there's one attack and one, I think, attack. So one of the first attacks, the Maddox is going to exchange some shots with a torpedo boat. That's not necessarily that uncommon around the world. I mean, it is uncommon, but it's not as bad as it sounds. This is like a gnat flying around just one of these. It's more annoying than it is absolutely dangerous. One of these boats could get lucky potentially, but for the most part, it's just like, go away, you're irksome. And so there is this attack. But then what we're going to see is, so that's the first attack on August 2nd. There is a second attack that is going to be reported on August 4th. And so this specific attack probably didn't actually happen. But one of the radar guys that is, checking out the sonar believes he sees a potential missile attack from one of these torpedo boats. And so, the radar guy, reads this sonar ping. But today we most historians say that the guy actually probably read the ping wrong, and that it wasn't an actual attack. And so he reads that the ship has been attacked. It's going to be the U.S. intelligence officers that are on board this ship that see this as an opportunity. U.S. intelligence for a very long time believes that they can defeat the North Vietnamese, but they've been held back by the constraints of, hey, we're just here to aid the South. We're not going to take a major role in it. And they're really frustrated because they feel like they can accomplish this mission if they're just given the ability to unleash the might of the American military. And so these U.S. intelligence officers are going to mislead American policymakers. And so they're going to write a report that, hey, we were attacked. The North, this is an act of war on the North's behalf. They attacked us, and we need to attack back. And so they're going to report this to, U.S. policymakers, congressmen. They're also going to report it to Johnson. The indication is from Johnson's personal correspondence that when Johnson hears this, he sees a political opportunity to unleash the might of the American military, but he's pretty skeptical of the actual evidence that we were attacked here. It's not like, the Maddox sunk. Right. And so Johnson probably didn't actually believe that the second attack occurred. But what happens next is going to be super important, because Congress is essentially going to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is going to give the president very broad war powers without having to declare war. Right. So this is going to be a massive expansion of presidential power. Where the American government very rarely ever goes through the democratic process of declaring war anymore. The president just uses the War Powers Act. Uh, you know, that's going to be created here to justify using the military. And so it just essentially the president is going to, because of the War Powers Act, is going to be given 90 days to fight his war, and all he has to do is update Congress on every 90 days about what's going on with the war and cycle some troops around, and it gets him out of having to actually declare war, which then gives Congress at least some checks on presidential powers. And so the Congress really messes up here with the way that they word the War Powers Act and the amount of power that they give the president that they've never essentially been able to rein in. They'd have to rewrite the law. And so once the president has this ability to essentially fight this war without having to declare war, Johnson starts off using limited air attacks in the north. And so, we really, this is going to be a huge mistake in strategy here. We're really going to believe that we can win this war with our Air Force. The Air Force was so important during World War II that we kind of overemphasize its importance in later wars. Now, I'm the first to tell you the Air Force is one of the most important branches of the military. And if you're fighting an industrialized, economically advanced nation, it's critical to win wars. But that's not Vietnam. Hanoi, the northern capital, you can see it there all the way up. It's the yellow dot, the black dot with the yellow around it. They've got some modern industry and some stuff like that. Well, we're going to blow that up right away. The problem is, it's Vietnam is a farming nation. It's a nation that's been at war for, like all the fighting age men. Vietnam's been at war their entire lives, so they're battle hardened. They're ready to make sacrifice. They've really known nothing other than war because they've been fighting the French and World War II and all that for so long. They're just used to fighting, and they don't really have anything to blow up. We're really going to start dropping bombs on the most of the routes into the South that get supplies into the South. The VC are just dirt pathways, mud paths within the jungle. That's the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that's not a highway system or a railroad track. You blow up a highway, drop a bomb on a highway, you can't drive cars or trucks on it anymore. Drop a bomb on a railroad, the trains can't travel on it. You can't get supplies in. Well, that's not how the North Vietnamese do things, right? They literally put their supplies in backpacks, strap it on somebody's back, and they walk from through the jungle from the north to the south. They're going to make that trip on foot. And if you blow up a dirt path, that's nobody's driving a car down, and there's just a big hole in the ground. Well, what's the guy with the backpack do? He just walks around the hole, right? And so it's not. We're going to be dropping $1 million bombs on mud huts and trails in the dirt. How effective is that going to be? Maybe not that effective, right? And so the Gulf of Tonkin is after the Gulf of Tonkin, and after we see some shenanigans with the military's reporting of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is when America's really going to start to take over and be the dominant force in this war. This is when the process starts. It's going to start slowly and then eventually build until we get to the Nixon administration, and then we're slowly going to start to hand back and lessen our involvement as we increase the South's involvement. So this is really the beginning of the meat of the war for America. And this is where we're going to end the lecture for today. So we'll pick up here in part 3. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly.